Well, welcome to day two. We have a busy schedule as usual. We're going to try and keep to time. It's not, as you know, it's not always easy. And we're starting with a keynote from someone who I regard as quite special in the world of sarcoma. Professor Wynette van der Graaf is a medical oncologist. She works with the National Cancer Institute in the Netherlands, and she is a professor of medical oncology at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She has been a sarcoma specialist oncologist for many, many years. She's been a great friend of SPAGN over the years, and she is currently the president of EORTC, a great honor, the leading pan-national clinical trials organization in Europe and indeed worldwide, with collaborative trials across national boundaries. So it's my pleasure to welcome Wynette to give us our keynote talk today. The title we gave, "The Patient in the Room, Do We Really Listen?" is perhaps not very clear what it's intended to mean. But the patient in the room is the patient who is getting involved in research, which is one of the themes we've had coming through, as you will recognize from yesterday. So, the patient in the room, do we really listen? Wynette, welcome.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all for being here. I think you are such a special organization of patients in such a very rare disease, and I really highly value the whole organization, SPAGN, which is now something that I can't pronounce, but it's global, and that's the most important thing. Or it's SPAGN now, and I think it's great that we are here. So the title of my talk was "A Patient in the Room," and the voice of the patient, and well, it was a bit confusing to me, but we discussed we should talk about patients who really can bring something as input in sarcoma research, because as you are sitting here, you are all very valuable in your experiences in moving the field forward. And maybe you not always have the idea that that is the case, but that really is the case. And today I will try to give some examples where your opinion and your contribution has shown to be very valuable or can be in the future. And I will also show what we as clinical doctors can do better in clinical trials and research, and where we can meet each other more often in whatever way. So it was nice to see that we were also welcomed by the Irish Sarcoma Group on Twitter. They are very active these days. And yes, Ireland is very special because in autumn we will have the global sarcoma meeting here in Dublin as well. So these are my declarations of interest. Roger mentioned already that I'm the president of the EORTC. I'm also leading the Dutch AYA Cancer Network, and I will talk about that after the coffee break. So main questions in clinical practice in general when the patient is in the room, namely the room in my hospital, is how long will I live? Are there any treatments? Are there any new treatments? And how will my future look like? And the question is, do we really answer these questions in research? And I will, well, talk with you that may be, well, at least can be better than we have done so far. The interesting papers have appeared over the last couple of years, especially also from the group of Queen's University in Kingston. That's a university with a very patient-centered focus, where they also do a lot on critical appraisal of the literature. And this is a very interesting paper where really the focus is on cancer treatment should benefit patients, a common sense revolution in oncology. And you would say, but cancer treatments are for the patients. Yes, but we also know that there's a lot of hype and to give hope, but that this hype is not always true, because, and that I will discuss later, a PFS benefit is a radiological benefit, and whether that really is impactful to patients is the question. So because of this paper, the group of Kingston invited 2 weeks ago in Kingston a group of 30 people from the whole globe to discuss what common sense in oncology actually is. How can we really serve the patients together with the patients? So here on this picture, and I was also happy to be invited there, are people from all over the globe with different backgrounds. There is some noise here. Can that be reduced? Yes. Can you hear me? Because then I just continue. Okay, I will speak in the microphone. And here there were also patients invited and contributed to this whole discussion on where we have to move the field to make it more valuable for patients. And it starts also with a critical appraisal of the literature. And that's something that's also important to be able to do that. When we speak about soft tissue sarcomas and sarcomas in general, we see that they are very heterogeneous. They are across the whole lifespan. There is no malignancy that can occur at 5 months of age and also at 100 years. So that makes it quite challenging when you speak about how to have patients contributing to their research, because as we can all understand that a 90+ patient would be less active and able to be involved as a younger one, although maybe we underestimate what they can do. So how to involve patients in research in such a heterogeneous disease as sarcoma is, I don't need to explain in this audience how many histologies we see in sarcoma. It's over 70. I mentioned already the age range, so how can you do this? And I like this very much from Steve Jobs, this quote: you have to start with the customer experience and work back towards the technology, not the other way around. So we should find ways, that's at least my interpretation of this quote, that we involve as many people as possible. Although, of course, there can be different barriers, physical barriers, language barriers, whatever. And because of this, SPAGN some years ago approached researchers, my research group actually also, to be involved in setting the agenda in sarcoma research based on the input of patients. So that was the first, I would say, collaboration in research that really focused on topics of interest for patients. And this was published recently. That was the first evaluation of this whole effort, and that was called Setting the International Research Agenda for Sarcomas Together with Patients and Carers. And that is what you call a priority setting partnership. And what we learned, there was a lot. So we approached many stakeholders, as we call it, that are important in research, sarcoma patients, carers, but also professional organizations and also industry professionals, all with the experience of patients. And the most important things were the topics of research highlighted by patients. And you see a whole list of 23 items, and we classified them by origin of sarcoma. So why do I get this disease, diagnostic process, treatment, side effect, prognosis, quality of life and end of life. And I selected some of those I will discuss later. So the results led to this identification of the most important topics, and they are also important when funding agencies have possibilities to submit clinical trial proposals, because you can say this is actually what patients want to be investigated. So it's not just to tick the box at the last moment before an application is submitted. This is something patients really find of importance. And part 2 of the survey of the study is now open, I saw on the SPAGN website, so I think everybody is invited to contribute here. So I will focus on the questions or the topics raised by the patients, so new treatments, new trials, quality of life and living with and after cancer. When you talk about patient involvement in clinical trials, it's important to understand that there are different moments in the whole journey of a clinical trial where you as a patient can be involved in. I hope you can read it. The first thing is the pre-development. So it all starts with a good idea. What really do you want to be investigated? And you can say, well, that's clear. Well, that's often not very clear, because if you want to have a new drug, do you want that the endpoint of the trial will be overall survival or progression-free survival or response or less pain or a better quality of life or whatever? That's very important, and we need the patients together to look at it. And we need also patients to say, well, because then as researchers we ask, do we have these patients to answer this question, whether there are sufficient patients and whether sufficient patients find this question of relevance, and not only you in the room, but that you think this is indeed something of relevance. Just an example. Then we have the whole development of a clinical trial, where you also discuss things like how often is imaging and lab research being done in the process of a clinical trial. How often do you need to go to the hospital? Is it doable? Is it expensive? All kinds of things like that. The execution of a trial, there we need people who are sitting on a trial steering committee. And in fact, in the last thing is the dissemination of the results. So what is often is done now is that patients are involved in the early stage of the trial design. So do you think it's important? Can you say something about this trial? Can you read the patient information sheet? But then in the end, when the results are there, we forget to make a lay summary. Well, the patients were involved there. So it should be that's the whole trajectory of a clinical trial where patients are involved in. And it's really very important, but that requires training, as you can understand. So training on endpoints of clinical trials. Is it a RECIST response? What is RECIST response, by the way? Relapse-free survival, local relapse-free, event-free survival, disease-free survival. What does this all mean? And does the trial answer these questions, or is it overall survival of quality of life? And there are some interesting papers over the last years about what is really meaningful to patients in general. Like progression-free survival, does it have any relationship with survival as the terminology, I would say reflects? Or is it better to have a progression-free interval, the time that on the CT scan your disease is stable? And is there an association with endpoints, like when do you have also a better quality of life? In general, it seems to be in this evaluation on the bottom of this slide that for RCTs with a PFS endpoint, not quality of life is always related to an increase in PFS, but for overall survival, it generally is. So these kind of things we have to learn together. So I'm, with my role as also as a lead in patient involvement in the EORTC, we also have worked on training in how can you involve patients, not only sarcoma patients, but patients in general. So we give now a workshop, a biannual training, the Patients Day, where we really address all these topics of clinical trials. We also are doing a research project, one of the headquarters fellows, on how to involve patients in clinical trials. And during breakfast, I had a very interesting conversation with Marcus already, how they do it in Germany and what we can learn from each other, because it's not so easy, of course. Patients, when they are involved, how do we involve them? How can we express our gratitude to them? How can they stay on board if they are feeling sick or whatever? So this is all pretty challenging, in fact, and we have to learn from this together and also from other organizations. So patients can also be on disease-oriented groups when trials are discussed and give their input. Just your own experience is already of great value. So don't think that you can't do things, because we need everyone. And an IDMC, that is an independent data monitoring steering committee of a clinical trial, that really requests something else than just your experience, that really requests knowledge of clinical trials. So how can we improve? That's the second question. How can we improve the input from patients just on a clinical trial? So the patient-reported outcome, not only toxicity scoring and radiological response. That was also one of the topics that came up. Quality of life is deemed important. So how can we measure that? Well, PROs, as we call it, they provide a unique information from the patient perspective, and that's what we want to know, because they give what we call a net clinical benefit, because you weigh the benefit of living longer versus the toxicity of the drug, maybe also the toxicity on your finances or your time spent in clinic, the time toxicity, a new term. So that's all, I would say, collected in PROs and PROM measurements. So we do that a lot, but despite the fact that it is important to do, we also see that PRO measurements are really underscored of importance in clinical trials. So it's really becoming better nowadays. But I'm also afraid that sometimes it's a bit of a tick the box. We also had some questionnaire and okay, we did what we had to do. So that's not really how we would like to have it. So the most common patient-reported outcomes are on health-related quality of life, functional outcomes, so what can I really physically do, your mental health and specific symptoms like fatigue and appetite and things like that. When we speak about health-related quality of life, that really discuss domains of physical, psychological, and social functioning. And what we see in most health-related quality of life data research is that sarcoma patients really have a poorer health-related quality of life than the general population. You will not be surprised, I think. There was a nice study done by our colleagues in Germany where they measured this with a very often used questionnaire, the EYTC QOQC 30, that has 30 questions. And where you can see here, the light bars are the patients with sarcoma, and the dark ones is the normal population. And when you look at the different domains, you see that on all the domains in this cross-sectional study, all the patients scored worse than the normal population, and on the bottom had more symptoms than the normal population. So how do you measure quality of life in such a heterogeneous disease? That was something that our research group asked ourselves, because you can have a sarcoma of your head and neck or the leg, and are we questioning the right questions? So it started with one of our PhD students who worked on unraveling the heterogeneity of sarcoma patients' health-related quality of life with a focus on tumor location. And I will not go into detail, but the emphasis in the conclusion was on physical functioning and disability. That was mainly a problem for patients with extremities sarcomas. In head and neck sarcomas, they had more neurological and mental problems. Patients with retroperitoneal sarcoma had functional limitations and gastrointestinal problems. There was remarkable no literature on patients with chest sarcomas or urogenital sarcomas. And what we saw that when you have metastatic disease, that overrules everything from the location. That is life-threatening, and that impacts the quality of life, independent from the location of your primary tumor. There was also a question raised by this SPAGN questionnaire. I showed you the paper on survivorship. So we also did a survivorship study in the Netherlands on sarcoma survivors 2 to 10 years after diagnosis, and we asked patients from the sarcoma centers 6 months to be involved, and these patients were diagnosed between 2008 and 16. We had almost 1,100 participants, and we focused on tumor location and age, and we only asked adult patients, by the way, so they had to be 18 plus at diagnosis. And the conclusions of this research project was that there was a wide variety in health-related quality of life. And a bit to our surprise maybe, was that patients who were younger at diagnosis, so really below the age of 40, they had a greater impact on their quality of life than patients who were elderly. Like when you are older and have also other comorbidities and have spent already a long life, then maybe the disabilities that you have related to your sarcoma are felt as less impactful on your total quality of life than when you are young and have to deal with it, and the gap with your peers who are healthy is greater. The younger ones also had worse scores on emotional and cognitive functioning. An important thing is those people who had received chemotherapy or had a bone sarcoma or comorbidity, they were having the lowest quality of life scores. And interestingly, this didn't differ whether you were diagnosed recently or longer ago. So there was no difference across the groups. Then I would like to end with a very special project I discussed briefly with Roger this morning. That's also not focused on sarcoma patients only, but it gives us a way how patients also with metastatic disease can contribute in research projects. And this is a project which we called INVIA. That was an investigation of young adults, so below the age of 40, diagnosed with metastatic disease, who were on longer treatment, so chemotherapy, novel treatments, or patients with a low-grade glioma, of which we know that in the end, in 7 to 10 years, they may die from the disease. So all these patients were almost certain that they would have a premature death, but were at a stage that they were fit enough to participate in this research project. This project was led by Vivian Burgers, who is a psychologist herself, and I will come back to how important that has been in this research project. So we, first of all, named this group as patients with a limited with a life-limiting disease. And we asked the patients whether they liked this terminology for this project. And with them, we changed it, and we came to patients with an uncertain or poor prognosis. And that was really something they really would prefer to as a term. So here are the inclusion criteria. They had to be between 18 and 39 at diagnosis. There's no hope of cure, but it indicated that the patient who died prematurely was able to speak Dutch, and the patients were recruited by healthcare professionals and researchers, patient organizations, and were asked to really be actively involved in at least one of the phases of this research project. And these are the patients. As you can see here, there were also 2 sarcoma patients, an osteo and a rhabdomyosarcoma patients. The patients had a young age, mean age 27, with a range, as you can see here. There were 2 patients with a low-grade glioma. There were 3 on active surveillance and not having treatment at the start when they participated. 2 on chemo, 2 on target, and 1 on hormonal treatment. And the whole project was meant to research how we as doctors can manage these patients, these young patients, in the clinical practice. Because often, the overarching idea is that patients will die, and we discuss treatment or no treatment and your scans, and we will ask, how are you doing? It's something that also for us as medical professionals is a challenging group, because they are so young. It feels so unfair. But at the same time, we don't ask them the questions that they want to be asked. And that was something, the basis of this project. So we asked the patients, what are the most important things we have to discuss? That was, for example, we have to discuss fertility, sexuality, relationship and work, etc. All topics of young people. And the doctors don't, well, at least from this research, we learned doctors don't do that, don't dare to do it, find it difficult. And in this whole questionnaire, because it were all interviews, the patients were involved. So how do you ask a question to a doctor or to a fellow patient who is involved in this project? And I will show you the results of the patient involvement part. So in the end, what we learned of this project was a lot, and the results are really due to be implemented in the development of a research project for how healthcare professionals can deal with this challenging group. But the interesting thing was also to ask the patients in the end, what did you think was the most important part where you contributed to? And that was in fact practical support, help with just practical tasks to arrange interviews, be a listener with an interview, so the psychologist did the interview with one of the patients, if it was allowed. A co-thinker, so what do you think of this result, or am I asking the right question? An advisor, giving unsolicited or solicited advice, being a partner, and also decision making. So what shall we do? Shall we give it another term? How shall we report the results? And so all patients were also part of our results publications. And these were actually all the parts of this whole journey where patients were involved in. And I must say, I learned a lot, not only from this project, but also on the way of how to best involve patients. So the conclusions were, what are the most important things? Build a trustful and open relationship. Patients felt more valuable by participating and being involved. You can imagine if you have this stage of disease, that is really important, that you feel you can contribute for not only yourself, but also for future patients. Focus groups were highly valued for debate and peer support. Investigators need education, as I told you, and successful patient involvement can also have a very important input on study conduct, results and outcome, not only for the study population, but also for those who contributed and their partners, so it's something they talk about at home. So we can only learn by doing if we have patients involved for clinical research. I only addressed a few topics, but you can imagine there are many. And I would like to acknowledge my research team. And on the right bottom side, you see Irina Shaknenko. She is the patient involvement lead at EORTC headquarters. With her, we work on how to have you all participating in disease-oriented groups at EORTC if you are there involved. Otherwise, you are very welcome. Really to contribute with your background to develop the best possible clinical trials. And with that, I would like to end and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Wynette. I'm going to give a patient view in just a moment, but is there any one critical question that anyone would really like an answer to before I present a patient viewpoint on some of these involvement issues? No, you're saving them up, right?
I'm Dr. Palmerini from Rizzoli, and I wonder in the project where patients that have no other treatment opportunity are involved in patients' initiative. I don't know, I cannot imagine myself in such a discussion. I mean, it's really tough because the patients usually come to you for a solution, and then you change perspective. I just would like to know if you consented them for this program and how was the process.
Yes, patients were, of course, really asked. There was a whole research project which we had to submit to ethics,
Okay.
and they had to, and there was a.
So maybe it's too early to respond to this question, or you already did. So my question was if I'm a patient and come to you for a solution and you ask me.
No, well, in general, sorry, we ask patients we already know. When you think you know them already, they are on treatment, and you think this patient is someone who really has you all know it, patients who really want to contribute with their own experience, and then we asked that the whole project was on what can we do for you as patients at this stage of the disease. So in fact, it's only that you ask them their experience, and it's not that they were not treated normally for their tumor type. This was a side project. Oh yes, it was totally, and she ran the project herself, Vivian. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, in partial response to that, I at one point in my own pathway found myself as a patient being treated by an oncologist. I would meet that oncologist on a national research group, a very different relationship. I would meet that oncologist helping him with some of his support work that he was doing, particularly around understanding quality of life in his clinic, a different kind of relationship. And then I found myself working with him, with one of the regulators, on developing guidelines, another sort of relationship. But when it came to me being treated, I was the patient and he was the doctor. And we had a good relationship. So it's really interesting when you begin to think about being involved in that kind of way. What I want to approach this question of the patient view, of the patient in the room, with that sort of thing in mind, because ultimately for me, the patient being involved with the doctors, it's all about communicating. Just think about that. Hearing and listening. Oh, I've got to use slides, haven't I? What have I got up there? Ah, there we are. Hearing and listening are two different issues, and you cannot talk and listen at the same time. It's very, very simple. But when you're working with the doctors, you need to listen, you need to question, you do less talking. And the challenge I always found was that I had to process what I was being told. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I'm coming and working in a scientific environment. So in order to understand, I quite often had to ask another question. What does that mean? And then how do I understand what they actually say to me? You know, I have to process things. And then there's a challenging question of the bigger issue of when we've got evidence from a piece of clinical research in which I've been involved, how do I make sure that that is understandable by other patients? If I can understand it, I'm on the road to achieving that. But I perhaps need a tool to help me develop that. And in addition, when I'm in the room, I want to be asked what I feel, what I think. I want to be able to respond not scientifically, but emotionally, if you like, to the situation. So it's a complex set of issues for the patient, which I'm trying to articulate, just as it's a complex set of issues for the doctor in developing that relationship. Now, I set a tool to help this evidence and understanding equation, and I've been working on that idea over a fair bit of time now. Click, right. Is there a pathway, an identifiable pathway, from evidence to understanding, to the plain language in which my understanding can be articulated? And I came to the conclusion that there were 3 steps on this pathway, 4, if you like, platforms with a step in between each of them. The clinical research produces data, numbers, essentially. Those numbers, in isolation, are meaningless. They need to be converted into information. But information is something cold and a bit unpersonal, dispassionate, if you like. I need something warmer. I need knowledge. I need to know what it means. What does that what does that information mean to me? And once I have that knowledge and I've got that meaning bit on board, I'm on the road to understanding. So the raw number becomes something that I can actually relate to if this pathway has been followed. Now, the 3 arrows are the 3 steps. So let's look at them. And I looked at them in the context of what action is involved, what's the quality, what character, if you like, again, that emotional word, and how is that step realized? How can I actually visualize it? And if you look at the first one of those, the action is analysis. The data needs to be analyzed in order to get to information. I want it to be trustworthy and reliable. In other words, is it reproducible in the scientific terms? Are those data reproducible in another study? Just my way of expressing it in this concept of reliable. And it's an explanation. The analysis, the information, is an explanation. If you look at the second arrow, that information needs to be interpreted in order to give me knowledge. The process of that must be transparent. If there are tools used in that, it must be obvious what the tools are, what approach is taken to do that interpretation. And obviously that has to be understandable. If it's going to be trusted and reliable for me, it's going to have to be understandable. And then that knowledge needs to be exhibited in some way. And it may well be a scientific paper. And Bernd and I are going to talk about abstracts to scientific papers later on in the marketplace session. And the final step, getting to understanding, it's about enabling learning. Understanding is learning. It helps if it's elegant, it's nicely expressed verbally, maybe some nice infographics. That's another skill which we need to draw on at times. It has to be relevant to me, and obviously I have to be able to explore it. We need some interaction in there as well, because that way I build my learning. And what that means, of course, is we have a whole set of other issues, other skills which need to come on board in order to make this happen. I don't possess all of them. You might argue I don't possess any of them. But if I can identify them and bring the people in who can produce the work of that standard, who can use their skills to our end, I'm on the road. So it's perhaps slightly complicated look at it, but when I'm involved in a clinical study, I want the data that clinical study produces to be understood by the patient group to whom it is relevant. And here is a tool, if you like, which takes me down that pathway and helps me identify what is needed at different stages in order to achieve that ambition. So, a slightly different way of looking at things, perhaps, but one I think to discuss. So, an opportunity for a bit of discussion. Want to get your reflections on what you've heard, particularly to Wynette. Are there any issues you think in there which we haven't addressed and which we should address? What are the changes we seek? You know, Wynette has told us about what is happening through ERTC and the area that she has been a very powerful influence in there, in bringing patient involvement into greater prominence. Ideas we can all take away and act on, things we can use. And what should SPAGN take note of? And by the way, I call it SPAGN. The G is silent. So, Wynette will work with the microphones. If you take that one.
Oh, yes.
Okay? Oh, no. The cooling system's gone off again. It seems to have a life of its own, that, doesn't it? Sit down, creak my limbs. Right, so discussion. Anyone want to bring up any points, particularly aimed at Wynette? Oh, hands shot up immediately. Brandy, you go first.
Oh, I'm very passionate about this one. So I can speak from the US perspective, and most even government funding or research funding, you have to have patients involved in the process. And I think one thing, and I say that too, I love all of our pharma partners in the room. I say this in my meetings with them. There's this concept of if we build it, they will come. And not taking, and then asking, why are they not coming to the trials? And I think what's really important is having, and we know this and we say it, but I think we have to be more intentional as patient advocacy organizations to really push this, that the patients are involved from the very beginning. From the very beginning, intimately involved in the clinical trial process and the design and the protocols and all of those things. It's not just taking the information and how do we better interpret it? How do we better take the language and put it out there to help recruit to the trial? It's not about taking the data and explaining it to the patients as to why this data is great or when the treatment gets approved, why they want that treatment. There's so much more to it from the very beginning, and having the patient voice represented from the in every single aspect of it is very important. It's not building the communication information about the trial and then sending it to us to review after the fact, because they see it from their perspective. That's not the patient's perspective. What others may think is important is not what's important to the patient. And I think we talk a lot about it. And I know in the US and other what we call big cancers, the patients are intimately involved in those things already. I think from a global group, it would be nice to see us all pushing that from the very, very beginning and saying this is the standard that has to be met. I know in previous place I've worked, we wouldn't even get involved in a trial or get patients involved unless it was from the beginning. So we weren't coming in from the back end. Anyway, I'm very, very passionate about this piece because I do think just because you build it doesn't mean patients will come. It doesn't mean that they can come. And so then we're at the back end trying to figure out how do we fix this? Well, it's too late then because you didn't get the patient voice from the beginning. And you have to see things from the patient's voice.
Wynette?
I can only confirm what you are saying. I think you are so much more powerful than you think. Because if patients say something, it's seen as more trustworthy than if doctors are saying it, because there's always a kind of, oh, they want to have their research project approved or whatever. And when we look at EORTC where trials are not running very well, then often the question comes back, was the question really the question that patients are interested in? Or is there controversy in between medical specialists that they are already very opinionated about whether or not give one of the two treatments in a randomized trial? And that could have been foreseen in a better way when patients were involved. I must say there are some challenges there. First of all, to find the patients who are willing to participate, because it's an investment of your time, and there's not a good way of, well, saying thank you very much for what you have done, other than what I'm saying. And of course we can train patients, so there's a lot of, kind of reimbursement in this way, but finding patients and keeping them on board, because they are patients for a reason. So the group where you can start with a project can differ along the journey of a clinical trial. But I totally agree with you, if you have patients involved in the design of a clinical trial, that's very important. And other thing is then it's important not to have one person from one country, but to have, well, if you do international relevant trials, you need to have more of patients, because everyone is speaking from their own perspective that we do all day, but that also is applicable to this situation. And that is even more difficult, to have more patients. And if you know the solution, I'm happy to hear during the break, because that's really what we need.
But you yourself have actually solved that with your most recent trial, haven't you? Your tolerance trial. You had, I think, 6 or 7 patients altogether, yes, across special boundaries.
That's a very interesting comment. That's a study where we are treating patients with metastatic soft tissue sarcomas, elderly patients, so about over the age of 70, in a randomized clinical trial with 3 treatment arms. There are classical drugs involved, no fancy ones, but these are questions that are relevant in daily clinical practice, because these are the drugs we have on the shelf. This trial doesn't run. And we asked the patients from the beginning, and which are the reasons? Well, it was developed pre-COVID, so we have more problems now, especially also, well, in different countries, patients need to come to hospitals, maybe more often than when you are treated outside the clinical trial. Financial problems are playing a bigger role than before. But also, maybe not all the treatment arms are that attractive, and there's no new drug involved. Well, everybody agrees this is a relevant question, and we have quality of life as the primary endpoint of this trial. So even then, and even although we involve the patient, it's a difficult one. And we can't sometimes predict that COVID comes and that an economic problem affects clinical trials. And when you have trials run by pharma, then there's much more money involved. So patients can be paid for their travel costs, etc. And the investigators and the hospitals get better paid than if you run an academic trial. And that is really a pity, because it makes a huge difference. If we would have a fancy drug in this trial, it would make a huge difference.
Right, Jane, you had a question.
Yes. I recently attended the conference in Lugano, and I heard this sort of theme, which was about involving patients at the earliest stages in the design of clinical trials. So taking that on board, because one of the questions is, how do you do that? And obviously the trials that I suppose I've had knowledge of have mainly been trials that have been coming to the UK because they're opening up an arm in, say, the Marsden or something. But by the time we get to hear about it, it's already, it's just we're hearing this is the date it's starting. The design of it, how it was constructed, etc., presumably happened a long time ago in America. So I have asked a number of people, were patients involved in the design of this trial? And the answer I've got is we don't know. So I'm just wondering what could be done to, if this theme is embraced and considered to be a good way forward. I was thinking, how could you actually make it that there was somewhere for people who are in the earliest stages of planning to do a clinical trial, they could actually go to identify patients who it would be useful to be involved in such a trial, because pharma companies, presumably in the main, don't initially have that connection. So I was then thinking, well, NICE, for example, if you use them as an example, they have a list of people who have already put themselves forward as being available for consultation on a particular subject. Would it be appropriate to have some kind of list held somewhere that it would be natural for any company or organisation thinking about setting up a clinical trial to go to say, well, that's the people we'd contact to at least start the process of trying to identify patients? I don't know, it's just a few thoughts really on the subject.
It's a really excellent question. To be honest, the start of a clinical trial from pharma is sometimes a bit, at least, misty to me. They have advisory committees, and sometimes when you're asked for it, then the trial, well, then the design is already set. Then I am thinking, why am I wasting my time here to contribute to anything to the trial, because you have already almost started it. And that's for clinical doctors. Then the other thing is, they are not, I think, not allowed to be involved with patients, at least not that they pay patients for it. But I'm not sure how that differs between countries. I, well, more and more know that it differs between countries. And often they say, when you ask them, yes, we have asked whether this is a good trial, but I have no idea how and whom and etc. So you're exactly right, and this is also why we emphasize to pharma that we would like to run clinical trials through academic groups. There are cooperative academic groups in the US, and there is the EORTC. So if they would be willing to work with us, and we have our patient panel already there, then they can indirect already make use of the availability of these patients, because the discussions start in these cooperative groups really from scratch, from the design of a clinical trial. And at the moment, at least it is a bit my mission to bring this, well, as a part of an argument, to the pharma, that if they run their clinical trials through cooperative groups, then they have access to excellent statisticians, to patients, and that in the end, we also learn much more, because the data are also in the academic field, and they sit there and we can compare these data with each other. Well, if the study is totally run by pharma, we as academics have no access to the original database. And I tell them this is really making, well, it's giving a very wrong signal to the academic and to the patients, because we can't make progress in rare diseases in this way. We need the data of all these individual patients with these rare diseases, how they did on a certain drug. And well, I think there is a bit, when you say it very straightforward in this way, okay, yeah, maybe there's some understanding and blah, blah, blah. And what you are saying is an additional excellent argument we can use. If you come to us, we can have independent patients who are already sitting in the disease-oriented groups who can contribute to the design of a clinical study. So thank you for this comment. I think it's really helpful.
I think it's probably fair to add that every pharmaceutical company is different. They all run their own ship. There are ones that I would call good, and there are some that I would regard as poor in that respect. And I think a tribute needs to be paid here to the regulators, the FDA in the States, EMA in Europe, the MHRA in the UK, who are taking steps to, as far as they can, to ensure that patients have an input into the design and development of clinical studies, and that patients continue their involvement with that study, so they're there to take part in the analytical process that delivers the results that the regulators are obviously, at the end of the day, want to be able to see, because that's where they're going to make their mind up, what they're going to make their mind up about. But there are good and there are bad. I think you want to add something to this, Marcus.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. And this is a very good preparation for another talk after lunch, when we'll talk about our experience in Germany. But in general, for patient involvement in clinical research, I think we have two main factors. One factor is we need to change the mindset. We need to change, we need a cultural change how we want to do research in the future. And this means we also need to convince our medical colleagues what are the benefits of doing this, but also how we want to do this in the near future. Because when we look to our German experience, on one side, you have people like, you met him yesterday, Stefan Fröhling or Bernd Kasper. These are people who are 150% have the opinion that patient involvement makes absolutely sense, and they have seen a lot of benefits from this collaboration. On the other spectrum, we have doctors or experts who think we are now getting the dictators of patients. Patients will dictate research or something like this. This is the other part of the spectrum. Or this brings us additional burden if we want to involve patients. Then we have other doctors who want to involve patients, but more on a, I would say, lip services basis. So that means they want to integrate patient into their application, but not too deep. So they send you the application maybe 3 days before they have to send in the application. They need your signature, they need your support, but they don't involve you in the whole project. So it's a question of mindset with the doctors, because the doctors, so we need, it's a long way to go. And when I learned something from my colleague in Roger, when we started in Germany with the whole process, he mentioned to me, Marcus, it will not happen overnight. So it needs really time to prepare this. So mindset is one issue. And when it comes to our colleagues from pharmaceutical industry, I don't know, I think for the last 15 years, we communicating, we working with pharmaceutical industry on a European, on a global level. We did workshops and advisory boards and training courses and whatever, but they always think to understand, they always find patient involvement very useful, and it's wonderful to do it and wonderful to work with patients. But when it comes to reality, nothing happens, unfortunately, not on a national level, and our main problem is that many trials are started from US companies. So if we got the protocol, or if we got the trial in Europe or in Germany, things are done. We don't have any influence into the protocol. We don't have any influence, because then we have to live with the reality. So if we want to do patient involvement in clinical research, we need it via organizations like SPAGN on a global level, and then we need really, we need to fight for this to get into the pharma companies and really to do it, maybe also together with our US colleagues. And the second point is knowledge. Knowledge on the patient perspective. So patients need knowledge to be partners in research. So we need to train our colleagues so that they are more self-confident, that they are more knowledgeable in this field of research. Because in the moment when you do something like a crash course of clinical trials, maybe to a patient, so we tell you 3 hours what is the clinical trial and how we want to run clinical trials, the patient will be overwhelmed in sitting discussions about clinical trial design or protocols and all these issues. So we need to train our patients well on a European level like EOTC, on a national level, but maybe also in Spain, that we need specific trainings for our patients here. But we also need to train our medical colleagues, because many medical colleagues, they don't have a clue how to involve patients into the process. You just have heard about focus groups. I know a lot of doctors, they don't know how to do a focus group. So this is the other issue. One part is the mindset, and the other part is really information, education, training, so that everyone is really able to do it.
Thank you, Marcus. important set of points. Well, we're beginning to eat into your coffee time. So one last question to Annette. Is there anything you would like to add? Anything you would like to finish with?
Well, I again would like to say that your contribution is always highly valued, and I think it will be good if we get an idea of when you are not so fit and well, how you still can contribute. And that's something we should work on, how in a confidential way you can raise questions that you would like to be addressed or give your experience. I don't know, Marcus, how you are doing it in Germany. You will certainly tell about it. But that there is a kind of platform where we can really grasp these ideas from to learn for clinical trials, but also to set up our clinical daily practice in the best possible way.
Thank you. Can I ask you, please, to thank Professor Winnet van der Graaf in the traditional way before we go to coffee? Thank you, Annette.